Sometimes the coldest winters reveal the warmest hearts. In Wyoming Territory, 1887, a broken cowboy discovers that saving one life can heal his own. Delaney is barely surviving, a widower haunted by loss, scraping by on odd jobs. When a savage snowstorm drives him toward town, he stumbles upon a brutal scene, a pregnant wolf caught and tortured by townsmen seeking cruel sport. Most men would walk away. Cash simply can't. What he does next will risk everything. As he nurses the wounded animal in his remote cabin and watches her give birth, something long buried stirs within him. But when the townsmen discover the wolf survived, they come hunting. Could one act of compassion thaw a frozen soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The shack Delaney called home sat in a hollow between two ridges, sheltered from the worst of the wind, but catching precious little sun even in summer. One room, maybe 12 feet square, with an iron stove that burned more smoke than heat, and a single window whose oiled paper rattled in every breeze. The roof leaked in 3 places. He'd positioned his bedroll to avoid the worst of it. He'd been living there since the previous spring, after the family who'd built it moved on to better prospects in Montana. The rent was $2 a month, paid to a banker in Bent Creek who'd foreclosed on the property. Cash was 3 months behind, but the banker hadn't bothered to collect. Everyone in town knew Delaney had nothing worth taking. 3 years ago, he'd had everything. The thought arrived unbidden as Cash pulled on his boots in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. He pushed it away, as he always did, but his hand moved automatically to his coat pocket. His fingers found the small oval shape, worn smooth from constant handling, Sarah's locket. Tarnished silver, no bigger than a $1 coin. Inside, a photograph so small you had to squint to make it out. His wife, dark-haired and smiling, holding their infant daughter. Both gone now. 3 years in the ground, in a place Cash couldn't bear to visit. He closed his fist around the locket, felt its weight, then tucked it back into his pocket. Some mornings, it was the only thing that proved they'd been real. The stove had gone cold overnight. Cash fed it kindling and a few precious splits of wood, coaxing flame from the embers. While it caught, he pulled on his other boot, his wool coat, more patches than original fabric, and his hat, shapeless and stained with years of sweat and weather. He owned 1 change of clothes, 3 pairs of socks with holes worn through the heels, and a razor he hadn't used in 2 weeks. Outside, the world was iron gray and bitter. November in Wyoming Territory, with winter settling in like an unwelcome guest who planned to stay until March. The wind came down from the high peaks, carrying the smell of snow. More coming by the feel of it. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but soon, Cash had 2 horses, or rather 1 horse and 1 aging mare, who should have been put to pasture years ago. The horse, a rangy buckskin gelding named Tucker, was his working animal. The mare, Bess, he kept out of sentiment, and because selling her would have brought maybe $5. And he couldn't stomach the thought of where she'd end up. He fed them both from his dwindling supply of hay, checked their water, a skin of ice he had to break with a rock, and promised them nothing. Animals understood honest silence better than false comfort. The ride to Bent Creek took 2 hours, following a wagon trace that wound through stands of pine and across frozen creeks. Cash had work today, if you could call it that. Morton, who ran the general store, had mentioned needing help unloading a freight wagon. Half a day's labor for $1, and maybe some credit toward supplies. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep breathing. Bent Creek wasn't much to look at. 30 buildings scattered along both sides of a rutted main street, with a few more houses climbing the hillside to the south. The usual frontier assortment: general store, saloon, blacksmith, livery, a building that served as both church and schoolhouse depending on the day of the week. Maybe 200 souls called it home, most of them trying to scratch a living from ranching or timber. Cash had been one of them once. He and Sarah had filed a homestead claim 8 miles north, built a cabin with their own hands, cleared land for planting. Emma had been born there, in the bedroom Cash had framed, with pine logs he'd cut and shaped himself. For 2 years, they'd been happy. Poor, worked to exhaustion, but happy. Then the fever came. Scarlet fever, the doctor said, though he'd arrived too late to do anything but confirm what Cash already knew. Sarah first, burning up and delirious, then Emma. Cash had sat between their beds for 6 days, helpless, watching them slip away despite every prayer, every desperate promise he'd made to a God who apparently wasn't listening. He'd buried them on a hilltop overlooking the valley. Then he'd burned the cabin to the ground, unable to bear the thought of living in it alone, and walked away. He'd been walking ever since, in one way or another. Morton was waiting when Cash arrived, stamping his feet against the cold on the store's front porch. He was a thin man in his 50s, with a shopkeeper's careful eyes and a politician's false smile. "Cash," he said, nodding. "Wagons around back. Should be 4, maybe 5 hours of work. $1.50 if you can finish by noon." Cash nodded. They both knew he'd finish, and they both knew Morton would find a reason to pay only $1. It was the way of things. The freight wagon was loaded with dry goods from Cheyenne, sacks of flour and cornmeal, bolts of fabric, boxes of canned foods and ammunition. Heavy work, and the wind cut like a knife as Cash hauled each load into the storeroom. His hands went numb despite his gloves. His back, injured years ago in a fall from a horse, protested every lift. He worked steadily, finding the rhythm that made hard labor bearable. "Don't think, don't feel, just move." Around mid-morning, Reverend Holloway appeared, a concerned expression on his weathered face. He was a good man, Holloway, sincere in his faith, genuinely caring about his flock. He'd tried more than once to reach Cash, to bring him back into the fold. "Cash," he said, watching him work, "I haven't seen you at services in some time." "Been busy," Cash said, not looking up from the sack of flour he was positioning. "The Lord's work is never finished, but neither is the need for rest." "For fellowship," Holloway paused. "For healing." Cash set down the sack and met the Reverend's eyes. "I appreciate the concern, Reverend, I do. But I'm past healing. No one is past—" "I am." Cash's voice was quiet but final. "Thank you, though." Holloway lingered a moment longer, then sighed and walked away. Cash returned to work, trying not to feel the weight of the man's disappointment. By noon, the wagon was empty, and Cash's muscles burned with fatigue. Morton paid him with a silver $1.50 in credit. Cash had expected it, so the sting wasn't sharp. He bought coffee, beans, and a small sack of cornmeal, leaving him with a few cents on account. As he left the store, a boy of maybe 12 came running up. Tommy, who worked at the livery and seemed to have assigned himself as Cash's unofficial shadow whenever he was in town, Mr. Delaney. The boy's face was bright with excitement despite the cold. "Did you hear? The Gant boys caught themselves a wolf up on Baker's Ridge. A big one. They got it trapped and they're—" He hesitated, reading something in Cash's expression. "They're having some sport with it, I guess." Cash's jaw tightened. "Sport," that's what Cyrus said. "Him and his boys, and a few others. Took dogs and traps up there yesterday." Tommy looked uncomfortable. "I don't hold with it myself, torturing an animal like that, but nobody asked me." Cyrus Gant, of course. The blacksmith ran Bent Creek the way a man runs a saloon, loud, rough, and with little regard for anyone who couldn't match his strength. His 2 sons, Clayton and Jed, were cut from the same cloth, mean-spirited, quick to violence, always looking for something weaker to dominate. Cash had avoided them since coming to Bent Creek, recognizing the type. Men like that fed on confrontation. The smart play was to stay invisible, keep your head down, survive. "Where on Baker's Ridge?" he heard himself ask. Tommy blinked. "The old logging camp, I think." "East side, near the creek?" Cash nodded slowly. It was out of his way. None of his business. A wolf was just an animal, and animals died hard on the frontier. It was the way of things. He should collect Tucker, ride home, and forget about it. He thought of Emma, the way she'd cried when she'd found a bird with a broken wing. The way she'd insisted they try to save it, even though Cash had known it wouldn't survive. They'd kept it in a box lined with rags for 3 days, Emma checking on it every hour, bringing it water and seeds. It had died anyway, but she'd given it gentleness in its final hours. "Your heart's too soft for this world, little one." Cash had told her, smoothing her hair as she cried. Then the world needs more soft hearts. Papa, she'd said. Cash closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, Tommy was watching him with a curious expression. Thank you for telling me, Cash said quietly. He collected Tucker from the livery, checked the saddle, and swung up. The sky had darkened while he'd been working, heavy clouds rolling in from the northwest. The storm would hit before nightfall. Smart thing would be to head home now, beat the weather. Instead, he turned Tucker east toward Baker's Ridge. The wind picked up as he rode, carrying the first scattered flakes of snow. Cash pulled his coat tighter and kept moving, following the creek that wound up into the hills. He knew the old logging camp, knew most of this country, from his years working cattle and timber. It was maybe an hour's ride in good weather. Today, with the wind and the gathering storm, it would take longer. He wasn't sure what he planned to do when he got there. Probably nothing. Probably just turn around and ride away, confirming what he already knew, that he was a coward who'd lost his courage when he'd lost his family, but something pulled him forward anyway. Maybe it was Emma's voice in his memory. Maybe it was the simple fact that he'd spent 3 years trying to die slowly. And at least this offered the possibility of dying for something, or maybe, somewhere deep in the frozen wasteland of his heart, there was still a spark of the man who'd once believed that gentleness mattered, that mercy was worth the cost, that standing against cruelty was what separated men from beasts. The snow began to fall in earnest as Baker's Ridge came into view. The old logging camp was a scatter of rotting structures, a bunkhouse with no roof, an equipment shed leaning at a dangerous angle, the rusted hulk of a steam donkey half buried in undergrowth. The logging company had abandoned it 5 years ago when the timber played out, leaving their junk to decay into the landscape. Cash heard them before he saw them, men's voices, rough with laughter carrying over the wind. He slowed Tucker to a walk, approaching through the trees. The clearing opened before him and his breath caught. 6 men formed a loose circle in the snow. In the center, a wolf. She was grey and black, larger than most, and heavily pregnant, her belly swollen, sides heaving with exhaustion and pain. Her left hind leg was caught in a trap, one of those cruel devices with serrated iron teeth, designed not to kill quickly, but to hold and maim. Blood darkened the snow around her. Her muzzle was torn, probably from trying to chew through the chain that anchored the trap to a buried log. The men took turns approaching, jabbing at her with sticks, throwing stones. Each time, the wolf lunged as far as the chain allowed, snapping with what strength remained. Each time, the men jumped back laughing. Cyrus Gant stood at the edge of the circle, arms crossed, a satisfied grin on his broad face. His sons flanked him, Clayton, the older one, tall and raw-boned, and Jed, shorter but thicker through the chest. 3 other men Cash recognized from town completed the group. The wolf's yellow eyes burned with intelligence and defiance, even as her body trembled with shock and blood loss. She wasn't howling or whimpering. She faced her tormentors in silence, refusing to give them the satisfaction. Something in Cash's chest cracked open. Cyrus noticed him first. "Well now," he called out, his voice carrying false cheer. "Look who decided to join us. Cash Delaney, come to watch the show." Cash didn't respond. He swung down from Tucker, looped the reins over a branch and walked forward. "Caught her yesterday," Cyrus continued, warming to an audience. "Been running our trap lines up here for sport. This one's the biggest we've seen. Pregnant, too, can you believe that? Must have a den nearby, probably birthed here last year." He spat into the snow. "Wolves are getting bold, coming down closer to the ranches. Got to teach them who's in charge." The wolf tracked Cash with her eyes as he approached the circle. He stopped at its edge, studying her. The trap had nearly severed the tendons in her leg. Even if she survived, she'd never run properly again. The wounds on her muzzle were deep, exposing bone in places. She'd been at this for hours, maybe since yesterday. "Want to throw?" Clayton asked, offering Cash a rock the size of his fist. "See if you can hit her square." Cash looked at the young man, then at the rock, then back at the wolf. She met his gaze and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of pain, understood, of survival at any cost. He thought of Sarah, delirious with fever, begging him to make it stop. He thought of Emma, so small in her bed, her breathing growing shallower each hour. He thought of the helplessness that had eaten him alive as he watched them die. He thought of the carved wooden wolf he'd made for his daughter. The stories he'd told her about the wild. "Let her go," Cash said quietly. The laughter stopped. Cyrus straightened, his grin fading. What was that? Let her go. She's suffering for no reason. No reason. Cyrus's voice hardened. She's a predator, a threat, and she's ours. We caught her. We'll do what we please. You caught her for sport, Cash said, his voice still quiet but edged now. For cruelty. That's not the same as defending your stock. Who the hell are you to tell us? Clayton started forward, but Cyrus put out an arm. Easy, boy. Cyrus studied Cash with narrowed eyes. Are you feeling protective of this wolf, Delaney? That's interesting, seeing as you don't seem to care about much of anything anymore. Word is you're barely alive yourself most days. Maybe that's true, Cash said. But I'm alive enough to know this is wrong. Wrong. Cyrus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Let me tell you what's wrong. What's wrong is a man who lost his family and just gave up. What's wrong is taking charity from people while contributing nothing. What's wrong is telling honest men how to spend their time. He took a step forward. You want to save this wolf? Make me an offer. How much is she worth to you? Cash knew what was in his pockets. $1 silver and some change. Everything he owned in the world. I don't have anything, he said. Then you've got no say. Cyrus turned back to the wolf. Jed, hand me that stick. I want to. Cash moved. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it. He simply walked into the circle directly toward the wolf. The men shouted, startled. Clayton grabbed for his arm, but Cash shrugged him off, and something in his eyes made the younger man step back. Cash knelt in the snow beside the wolf. She lunged at him, teeth snapping inches from his face. He didn't flinch. Easy, he said softly. Easy now. He unbuttoned his coat, removed it despite the cold, and held it open so she could see it wasn't a weapon. The wolf's sides heaved, breath coming in ragged gasps. Her yellow eyes burned into his. I know, Cash said, still in that quiet voice. I know it hurts. I know you don't trust anything human. I wouldn't either. He slowly extended the coat, letting her smell it. But I'm going to help you. I need you to let me. He's lost his mind, someone muttered behind him. Cash ignored them. He kept his eyes on the wolf, kept talking in that low, gentle tone. I had a little girl once. She loved wolves. Made me promise never to hurt one. He moved the coat closer, inch by inch. I'm going to keep that promise now. The wolf snapped again, but weaker this time. Her strength was fading. Cash could see it in her eyes. The calculation, the desperate weighing of options. Fight and die, or trust and maybe live. That's it, Cash murmured. You're brave. Braver than I've been in a long time. He reached for the trap, moving slowly. The wolf tensed but didn't lunge. Cash examined the mechanism, a simple spring-loaded design, but the teeth had bitten deep into flesh and tendon. Opening it would cause more pain before it brought relief. This is going to hurt, he told her. I'm sorry. His hands found the pressure points. He took a breath, then squeezed hard, forcing the jaws open. The wolf thrashed, a strangled sound escaping her throat, but Cash held firm until the trap released completely. Blood welled fresh from the wounds. He pulled the coat around her quickly, wrapping her injured leg, pinning her jaws gently but firmly. She struggled, but had no strength left. Cash lifted her. She weighed maybe 80 pounds plus the weight of pregnancy, and stood, cradling her against his chest. He turned to face Cyrus. The blacksmith's face had gone dark with rage. You're stealing from us. You never owned her, Cash said. You just hurt her. Put her down, Delaney. Cyrus's hand moved to the knife at his belt. Right now. Cash felt the wolf's heart hammering against his chest, felt her hot breath through the coat fabric, felt for the first time in 3 years something other than emptiness. No, he said simply. The 6 men spread out, blocking his path to Tucker. Cash stood still, holding the wolf, waiting. Cyrus studied him for a long moment. Whatever he saw in Cash's face, or maybe what he saw in Cash's eyes, made him pause. Finally, he spat in the snow. You're a dead man, Delaney. You know that? Walking Dead might as well lay down now. He jerked his head at the others. Let him pass. It's too cold to teach a fool a lesson today. The men opened a path. Cash walked through them, slow and steady, the wolf trembling in his arms. He reached Tucker, and the horse danced nervously at the smell of blood and predator. But Cash calmed him with a word. Mounting was difficult with the wolf, but he managed, settling her across his lap. "This ain't over," Cyrus called after him. "You saved her today, but you can't protect her forever." "Wolves die up here, Delaney." "They all die." Cash turned Tucker toward home without responding. The snow was falling harder now, the wind picking up. The storm would be on them within the hour. The wolf lay still in his arms, her breathing shallow, her blood seeping warm through his shirt. He could feel her watching him, could feel the question in that gaze. "I don't know," Cash said quietly, answering the unspoken question. "I don't know why I did that. Maybe I'm as dead as he says." But his heart was beating harder than it had in 3 years. And his hands, holding this broken creature, felt almost alive. He urged Tucker into a trot, racing the storm toward home. The storm hit in full force as Cash reached his cabin, wind-driven snow turning the world white and howling. He barely got Tucker into the lean-to shelter before visibility dropped to nothing. The wolf lay motionless in his arms, her breathing labored but steady. Inside the cabin, Cash laid her in the corner farthest from the door, away from drafts. She didn't resist, which worried him more than struggle would have. He built up the fire quickly, feeding it until the stove glowed red, and heat began to push back the cold. By firelight, he examined her wounds properly. The leg was bad. The trap had crushed muscle and possibly bone, and infection had already set in, turning the flesh around the punctures angry and swollen. The wounds on her muzzle were deep but cleaner. He'd need to clean everything, and it would hurt her terribly. "I'm sorry," he said again, though she couldn't understand the words. "I know you've had enough pain." He gathered what he had, a bottle of whiskey, clean rags torn from a shirt, needle and thread, a jar of lard he could use as salve. It wasn't much. On the frontier, you learned to make do with nothing or you didn't survive. The wolf's eyes followed him as he moved, yellow and wary. When he approached with the whiskey, she tried to bare her teeth but managed only a weak curl of her lip. "I know," Cash said softly. He sat cross-legged just out of reach, letting her see his hands, empty and open. "You don't trust me." "That's smart. Trust gets you killed out here." He uncorked the whiskey, took a small sip himself, steadying, then offered the bottle in her direction, letting her smell it. "But sometimes you have to trust anyway or die alone." He waited. The wind screamed outside, rattling the window. The fire crackled. The wolf watched him. Slowly, moving with the patience of a man who had nothing but time, Cash edged closer. He kept talking, his voice low and even, telling her about the cabin, about Tucker, about the storm. Meaningless words, but the tone mattered. Animals understood tone. When he was close enough to touch, he paused. The wolf tensed. Cash extended one hand, palm down, and let it rest on the floor between them. "Your choice," he said. A minute passed, then another. Finally, the wolf's nose twitched toward his hand. She sniffed carefully, reading him through scent. Cash held perfectly still. She didn't bite. It was the smallest of victories, but Cash felt it like warmth spreading through his chest. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." He withdrew his hand, picked up the whiskey-soaked rag, and began cleaning the wounds on her muzzle. She whimpered and jerked away, but he held her gently firm, murmuring apologies. The lacerations needed stitches, but he decided against it. The risk of her tearing them out was too high. He cleaned them as best he could, applied lard to keep the wounds from drying out, and moved to the leg. This was worse. The swelling had increased, and heat radiated from the infected flesh. Cash washed it with whiskey, working carefully around the crushed tissue. The wolf shuddered with each touch, but didn't snap at him. Whether she was too weak or had chosen to trust, he couldn't say. When he finished, he sat back, exhausted. The wolf lay panting, her flanks heaving. Her belly moved visibly, the pups inside active despite their mother's distress. "You're going to have them soon," Cash observed. "Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow." "I don't know much about birthing wolves, but I know enough about birthing in general." He thought of Sarah, laboring through a long night to bring Emma into the world. The joy and terror of it. "You'll be all right. You're strong." He left water in a shallow pan within her reach, then positioned himself by the stove to give her space. The storm continued outside, wind finding every gap in the cabin's walls. Cash wrapped himself in a blanket and settled in to wait. He didn't sleep that first night. He kept the fire going, watched the wolf, and thought about the choice he'd made. Cyrus had been right about one thing. Cash had been dead, or near enough. For 3 years, he'd been going through the motions of living without feeling anything, without caring about anything, just waiting for the cold or hunger or simple despair to finish what grief had started. Then he'd seen intelligence and defiance in a wolf's eyes, and something in him had refused to let it be extinguished. The second day, the wolf wouldn't eat. Cash left strips of dried venison near her, retreated to the far side of the cabin, and pretended not to watch. She ignored the food. He tried rabbit he'd snared the previous week, thinking fresh meat might tempt her. She turned her head away. "Stubborn," Cash said without heat. "That's all right." "I understand stubborn." He went about his chores, feeding Tucker, bringing in firewood, melting snow for water, and narrated each action aloud. "Getting more wood now. Going to be cold tonight. Might get down below 0. The wolf tracked his movements, but remained motionless in her corner. That afternoon, while digging through a drawer for clean rags, Cash found the carved wooden wolf. He'd forgotten it was there. The sight of it stopped him cold, his chest suddenly tight. It was maybe 3 inches long, crude work. He'd never been skilled with a knife, but Emma had loved it. She'd carried it everywhere, slept with it under her pillow, given it a name he couldn't quite remember now. He turned it over in his hands, remembering. Emma begging for wolf stories at bedtime. Emma insisting wolves were brave and noble, not monsters like the adults said. Emma crying when a rancher had brought wolf pelts into town, wanting to know why people were so cruel. "Your papa used to make things like this," he said to the living wolf, showing her the carving, though she couldn't possibly understand. "For my daughter." She thought wolves were the finest creatures in all creation. His voice caught. "She was right, probably. Finer than most people, anyway." He set the wooden wolf on the floor between them. A bridge of sorts, the real wolf's ears twitched forward. The first sign of curiosity she'd shown. By evening, she drank the water. Cash counted it as another victory. He changed the rags on her wounds, noting with relief that the swelling in her leg seemed slightly less. The infection wasn't beaten, but maybe it wasn't winning either. The third day brought the first real breakthrough. Cash was sitting by the stove, mending a torn glove, when he noticed the wolf watching him intently. Not with wariness this time, but with something else. "What is it?" he asked. She made a sound low in her throat. Not aggressive, almost questioning. Cash stood slowly, moved to where he'd left the venison. He picked up a small strip, held it out at arm's length, and waited. The wolf's nostrils flared. Her tongue appeared briefly, then vanished. She looked at the meat, then at Cash, then back at the meat. "It's all right," Cash said. "You need your strength." She pushed herself up onto her front legs, dragging the injured back leg. The movement clearly pained her, but she managed to reach forward, stretching her neck. Her teeth closed carefully around the meat, barely touching Cash's fingers. She took it, retreated, and ate. Cash felt something unlock in his chest, something he'd thought broken beyond repair. Over the next hours, she accepted more food from his hand. Not much. She was weak and her stomach couldn't handle a full meal, but enough. Enough to live. That night, Cash allowed himself to sit closer to her corner, not crowding, just near enough that she could feel his presence. The wooden wolf figurine sat between them like a promise. "I'm going to call you Grace," he said quietly. "If that's all right with you, it's what my wife would have chosen." She believed in the possibility of grace, even when I didn't. The wolf, Grace now, watched him with those yellow eyes, intelligent and ancient. "Your pups are going to come soon," Cash continued. "And I don't know if we'll survive what comes after." Cyrus meant what he said. "But for now, for tonight, we're both alive." He paused, feeling the truth of the words. "That's more than I could say a few days ago." Grace laid her head on her paws, her gaze still fixed on him. The fire crackled. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried in fresh snow and crystalline silence. For the first time in 3 years, Cash, Delaney felt the weight of another heartbeat depending on his, and instead of terror, he felt purpose. Grace went into labor on the 4th night. Just after midnight, Cash woke to the sound of her restless movements, the scraping of claws on the wooden floor. He sat up immediately, fully alert in the way of men who'd spent years sleeping light in dangerous country. She was pacing, or trying to. 3 legs working, the injured one held awkwardly off the ground. She circled her corner, then stopped, panted, circled again. Her sides contracted rhythmically. Cash lit the lantern, keeping his movements calm. "It's time, then," he said quietly. He'd helped birth calves and foals, even assisted at a difficult human birth once when the doctor couldn't reach a homestead in time. But wolves were different, wild. He'd have to trust her instincts and stay out of the way unless something went badly wrong. He gathered clean rags and positioned more firewood near the stove, preparing for a long night. Then he settled himself against the far wall, making himself as unobtrusive as possible, and watched. Grace paced for another hour, her breathing growing labored. Finally, she lay down, curled on her side, and began to push. Her body contracted with visible force, her muscles straining. She made no sound beyond harsh panting. The first pup arrived just before dawn. Grace twisted around immediately, tearing the membrane away with her teeth, licking the tiny body vigorously. The pup was dark gray, about the size of Cash's fist, eyes sealed shut. It mewled weakly. Cash felt his throat tighten. Life, raw and new and impossibly fragile. The second pup came 20 minutes later, lighter in color than the first. Grace repeated the process, cleaning, stimulating, checking. Both pups began to nurse, their small bodies pressed against her warmth. The third pup took longer. Grace labored hard, and when it finally emerged, Cash's heart sank. It wasn't moving. Grace licked it frantically, pushing at it with her nose, but the pup lay still. Without thinking, Cash moved forward. Grace's head snapped up, a warning growl rumbling in her chest. He stopped immediately, raised his hands. "Please," he said. "Let me try." Grace's lips pulled back from her teeth. Her eyes blazed, but then another contraction hit. There was at least one more pup coming, and she couldn't focus on Cash and birth at the same time. He took the chance. He scooped up the still pup, its body cold already, and cupped it in his hands. He remembered the technique from a stillborn calf years ago, rubbed the pup's chest briskly with his thumb, cleared its nose and mouth, then blew a gentle puff of air across its face. Nothing. He tried again, rubbing harder, willing warmth and life into the tiny form. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, little one." A shudder ran through the pup. Then a gasp. Then a thin, outraged cry. Cash nearly dropped it in surprise. He quickly dried it with a clean rag, warming it against his chest, then carefully placed it back with Grace. She sniffed it suspiciously, then began to lick it with renewed vigor, accepting it back into the fold. The fourth and final pup arrived as the sun was rising, filling the cabin with pale light. This one was the largest, darker even than the first, with a distinctive white marking on its chest. It came into the world squalling and immediately began to root for milk. Grace lay exhausted, her sides heaving, surrounded by 4 tiny lives that depended entirely on her survival. She cleaned the last pup methodically, then laid her head down, watching Cash with an expression he couldn't quite read. 4, Cash said softly. "You did well, Grace. 4 healthy pups." He gave them space for the rest of the day, only approaching to leave food and water for Grace and to tend the fire. She ate ravenously now, her body demanding fuel for milk production. The pups nursed and slept, their small squeaking sounds filling the cabin with something that might have been joy, if Cash had allowed himself to call it that. That evening, while Grace dozed and the pups lay in a tumbled heap against her belly, Cash examined the white-chested pup more closely. It was the most adventurous, already trying to crawl despite eyes that wouldn't open for another week. "You're a bold one," Cash observed. "Like your mother," the pup mewled in response, a sound so pure and innocent that something in Cash's chest broke open completely. He reached out, slowly, carefully, ready to pull back, and stroked one finger along the pup's back. Its fur was impossibly soft, downy and warm. Grace watched but didn't object. Over the following days, a routine established itself. Cash hunted, rabbit, grouse, once a small deer that kept them fed for a week. He brought the meat back and cooked most of it for himself, but gave Grace the best portions raw. She ate everything he offered, her body working overtime to nurse 4 growing pups. The pups themselves were constantly hungry, constantly crying, constantly nursing. They doubled in size within days, their small bodies warm and pudgy. Cash found himself watching them for hours, mesmerized by their clumsy movements, their tiny growls when they play-fought in their sleep. Grace's leg was healing slowly. The infection had receded, though she'd never regain full use of it. She could walk on it now, with a pronounced limp, but couldn't put her full weight down. It meant she'd never hunt successfully in the wild again, never run with a pack. She was dependent on Cash for survival, and they both knew it. But something else was developing too, not dependency exactly. More like partnership. Grace began to trust him near her pups. First just to observe, then to touch. When one pup squirmed away from the nursing pile and couldn't find its way back, Grace looked pointedly at Cash until he gently guided it home. When he cleaned her wounds now, she no longer tensed. When he sat by the fire in the evenings, she sometimes watched him with what might have been companionship. 2 weeks after the birth, Cash woke to find the smallest pup, the one he'd revived, curled against his leg, having wandered from the nest during the night. Grace sat upright, watching, but made no move to retrieve it. Cash carefully picked up the pup, feeling its heartbeat rapid and strong against his palm, and carried it back to its mother. Grace sniffed it thoroughly, then looked at Cash with those yellow eyes. An understanding passed between them, wordless but absolute. These pups belonged to both of them now. She would mother them, but Cash would protect them. Together, they would give these 4 small lives a chance. "All right," Cash said quietly, acknowledging the pact. "We're family now, I suppose." Grace's tail moved once, almost imperceptibly. Not quite a wag, but close. That night, Cash took Sarah's locket from his pocket and opened it, looking at the faces of his wife and daughter. The pain was still there, it would always be there, but it had changed somehow. Less like a wound, and more like a scar, still tender but no longer bleeding. "I found something to protect," he told them, though they couldn't hear. "I know it's not the same. Nothing could be, but maybe it's enough to keep me here a while longer." He closed the locket and placed it on the small shelf above his bedroll, next to the carved wooden wolf. 2 reminders. One of what he'd lost, one of what he'd found. In her corner, Grace nursed her pups, the firelight casting gentle shadows across them all. The wind moaned outside, promising more snow, more cold, more hardship. But inside the small cabin, something warmer than fire had taken root. Cash lay down, listening to the small sounds of life around him, and slept better than he had in 3 years, 3 weeks after the pups were born. Cash ran out of coffee. It shouldn't have mattered. Coffee was a luxury, not a necessity. But it represented a larger problem. His supplies were depleted across the board. Flour, salt, ammunition. He'd been feeding himself and Grace from what he could hunt and trap, but winter hunting was lean. He needed to go to town. The thought filled him with dread. He'd been avoiding Bent Creek since the day he'd taken Grace. He knew what that meant. Cyrus would have spread the word, turned the story to his advantage. By now, half the town probably thought Cash was harboring a dangerous predator. The other half thought he'd lost his mind. Both might be true, in their own way, but supplies were supplies, and he couldn't let Grace and the pups suffer because he was too cowardly to face a few hard looks. So on a clear, bitter cold morning, he saddled Tucker and prepared to ride. Grace watched him from her corner, the pups nursing at her belly. They'd grown substantially. Their eyes were open now, revealing bright yellow irises like their mother's. They were starting to play, tumbling over each other with mock ferocity. The white-chested one, the boldest, had already tried to follow Cash around the cabin. Tiny legs, carrying it a few feet before it collapsed. "I'll be back before dark," Cash told Grace. "You keep them safe." Grace's ears swiveled forward, listening. She'd learned to recognize certain phrases, certain tones, or maybe she just understood intent. Either way, she seemed to accept his departure. Cash rode slowly, conserving Tucker's energy. The landscape was locked in deep winter now, every branch laden with snow, every creek frozen solid, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Bent Creek looked the same as always, the same buildings, the same people going about their business. But Cash felt the change the moment he rode down the main street. Conversations stopped. Eyes tracked him. The usual nods of acknowledgement didn't come. He tied Tucker at the rail outside Morton's store and went inside. Morton was arranging canned goods on a shelf. He glanced up, and something complicated crossed his face. Not quite hostility, but not welcome either. "Cash," he said neutrally. "Morton." Cash pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket with a list he'd written. "Need some things. Got a little money this time." It wasn't quite true. He had $3, scraped together from odd jobs before the wolf. It wouldn't cover everything he needed, but it was a start. Morton took the list, read it over, and began pulling items without comment. The silence stretched awkwardly. Finally, Cash broke it. "Quiet in town today, is it?" Morton didn't look up. "Seems normal to me." The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air. Cash glanced over and his stomach tightened. Cyrus Gant, with his son Clayton close behind. The blacksmith stopped when he saw Cash. A slow smile spread across his face.
Well.
"The wolf lover himself. I wondered when you'd show your face again." Cash turned back to Morton, ignoring him. "How much do I owe?" $2.40, Morton said quietly. "Heard an interesting thing," Cyrus continued, his voice loud enough to carry through the store. "Heard you've been keeping that wolf up in your shack. That true?" Cash counted out his money carefully, pretending deafness. "Unnatural, if you ask me," Cyrus went on. "And choosing an animal over his own kind. But then, you never were quite right after your family died, were you, Delaney?" Cash's hand stilled on the coins. The mention of Sarah and Emma, casual, dismissive, made his jaw clench. He forced himself to breathe, to keep counting. $2.40. Exact change. "My pa's talking to you," Clayton said, moving closer. "Your pa knows where I stand," Cash replied quietly, sliding the money across to Morton. "Nothing's changed. Everything's changed." Cyrus stepped between Cash and the door. "You stole our kill. You're protecting a predator. People have a right to know there's a wolf den up in the hills. She's not a threat to anyone. She's a wolf. That's all the threat needed." Cyrus's voice rose. "What happens when those pups grow up? When they get hungry enough to come down to the ranches? You going to feed them yourself?" Cash met his eyes steadily. "If I have to, you're a fool." "Maybe so." Cash picked up his supplies, wrapped in brown paper. "But she's hurt no one. She's nursing pups. And I'll keep her safe as long as I'm able." "You won't be able for long." Cyrus's voice dropped, becoming almost gentle. "Winter's hard up there. Animals die. People too sometimes. Would be a shame if something happened to you, Delaney. Who'd look after that wolf then?" The threat was clear. Cash felt cold settle in his gut, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'll manage." He moved toward the door. Cyrus didn't step aside immediately, forcing Cash to angle past him. As he did, Cyrus spoke quietly, meant only for Cash's ears. "We know where you live. Remember that." Cash paused at the threshold, looking back. "And you remember this, I don't have much left to lose. A man with nothing to lose is more dangerous than you think." He left before Cyrus could respond. But he felt the weight of the blacksmith's stare following him down the street. At the livery, where he stopped to buy oats for Tucker, young Tommy appeared from the back. His face troubled. "Mr. Delaney," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I shouldn't tell you this, but Cyrus has been talking. Him and his boys, and a few others. They're planning something." Cash's chest tightened. "What kind of something?" "I don't know exactly, but I heard them mention your cabin. And they've been gathering supplies, rope, torches, dogs." Tommy hesitated. "They mean to go after that wolf, sir. And they don't much care what happens to you in the process." Cash absorbed this, his mind already working through possibilities. "When?" "I'm not sure. Soon, maybe. After the next snow," Cyrus said. "Cover their tracks better. "Thank you, Tommy." Cash pressed a coin into the boy's hand, 50 cents he couldn't afford. "You're a good kid. You'll make a fine man." Tommy looked at the coin, then back at Cash. "Why are you doing this? Everybody says you've lost your mind over a wolf." Cash thought about Grace's yellow eyes, the intelligence and trust in them. He thought about the pups, so small and helpless, depending on him. He thought about the carved wooden wolf Emma had loved. "Maybe I have," he said honestly. "Or maybe I finally found something worth being sane for." He rode out of town faster than he'd ridden in, supplies strapped behind his saddle, Tucker's breath steaming in the cold air. The sun was already sinking toward the mountains, shadows lengthening across the snow. Cyrus's threat echoed in his mind. "We know where you live." Cash had faced danger before, in his cavalry days, in the hard years of homesteading, in the desperate months after Sarah and Emma died, when he'd half hoped something would end it for him. But this was different. This time he wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting 4 pups who couldn't defend themselves, and a mother who'd never survive alone. He thought of Sarah, what she'd say if she could see him now. She'd probably call him foolish, then help him anyway. That was the kind of woman she'd been. Practical, but unable to turn away from those who needed help. "I'm trying to be the man you thought I was," he said to her memory. "Even if it gets me killed." The cabin appeared in the distance, smoke rising thin and straight from the chimney. As Cash approached, he heard the pups crying. Hungry, probably, or just bored. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Inside, Grace looked up as he entered, then returned her attention to the white-chested pup, who'd gotten tangled in the blanket scraps Cash used for their bedding. Cash set down his supplies and helped free the adventurous little thing, earning a tiny growl for his trouble. "Trouble coming," he told Grace quietly, stroking her head. She'd started allowing that recently, even leaning into his touch sometimes. "Might be soon. We'll need to be ready." Grace tilted her head, listening. She might not understand the words, but she understood the tone. Understood danger. Cash looked around his poor cabin. Gaps in the walls, a roof that leaked, one window, one door. Not much of a fortress, but it was all he had, and he'd defend it. For Grace, for the pups, for the part of himself he'd thought dead and buried. He reached up to the shelf and took down both the locket and the carved wolf, holding them together in his palm. "I'm not running," he said to the memories they represented. "Not this time." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. Another storm coming, and with it, likely, men with torches and hate in their hearts. Cash began to prepare. The snow Tommy had predicted arrived 2 days later, falling thick and steady through the afternoon. Cash watched it from the cabin window, his rifle cleaned and loaded on the table, his mind calculating distances and approaches. The cabin sat in a natural hollow, which offered shelter from wind, but also meant limited visibility. Anyone approaching from the south could get within 50 yards before being seen. From the north, the ridge line provided cover almost to the door. Not ideal defensive terrain. Cash had spent the previous day reinforcing what he could, dragging deadfall to create obstacles on the most likely approaches, stacking firewood against the walls to provide extra insulation and cover, checking the chimney to ensure smoke wouldn't give away their exact position in the dark. It wasn't much. Against 6 men with dogs and determination, it might not be anything. But it was what he could do, so he did it. The pups were 5 weeks old now, more active every day. They'd started venturing around the cabin, exploring with puppyish enthusiasm. The white-chested one, which Cash had taken to calling Scout in his mind, was particularly bold. It had discovered the woodpile and spent hours climbing on and around it, developing muscles and coordination. Grace watched her offspring with patient attention, occasionally correcting them with a gentle nudge of her nose when they got too rambunctious. But more and more she looked to Cash to help supervise. When Scout wandered too close to the hot stove, it was Cash who scooped the pup away. When the smallest one got stuck under the bed, Cash who retrieved it. They were becoming his as much as they were hers. That afternoon, as Cash was reinforcing the door with an extra timber brace, he heard hoofbeats approaching. His hand moved to his rifle, but he recognized the horse. Reverend Holloway's old bay mare. Cash stepped outside, rifle held casually but ready. The Reverend rode up, his face red with cold, snow dusting his shoulders. "Reverend," Cash said neutrally. "Cash." Holloway dismounted stiffly. "Might I have a word?" Cash hesitated, then nodded. "There's coffee if you want to come inside. Though I should warn you, I've got company you might find unusual. I know about the wolf." Holloway's voice was gentle. "That's why I'm here." Inside, the Reverend took in the scene. Grace in her corner, the 4 pups tumbling around her, the whole domestic arrangement of man and wolves sharing space. To his credit, he didn't flinch or comment. He simply accepted the coffee Cash offered and sat on the stool by the table. "Cyrus came to see me," Holloway began. "Asked me to speak with you. To convince you to give up the wolf before—" He paused. "Before things escalate. Before he burns my cabin down, you mean?" He didn't say that in so many words. But yes, the implication was clear. Holloway looked at Grace, who watched him with wary attention. "I told him I'd talk to you. I didn't promise I'd try to change your mind." Cash sat across from him, surprised. "Why not?" "Because I've seen men do terrible things in the name of righteousness," Holloway said quietly. "I've seen cruelty dressed up as necessity, violence justified by fear. What you're doing here—" He gestured at the wolves. "It might be foolish, it might be dangerous, but it isn't cruel. And in my experience, God tends to favor the compassionate over the cautious." Something eased in Cash's chest. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed someone to understand, even partially. "She was dying," Cash said. "They were torturing her for sport. I couldn't—" He stopped, struggling for words. "I couldn't just walk away." "No," Holloway agreed. "You couldn't. That says something about who you are, Cash Delaney. Something your grief has been trying to hide, but couldn't quite bury." They sat in silence for a moment. Scout wandered over, sniffed at Holloway's boot, then climbed onto Cash's foot and settled there with a tiny sigh. Holloway smiled. "They trust you completely. Grace does most of the work. I make sure they're fed, safe." Cash stroked Scout's downy head with one finger. "It's not much. It's everything to them." Holloway set down his coffee cup. "Cash, I won't pretend this will end well. Cyrus is angry, and angry men do irrational things. If you continue on this path, you're putting yourself in real danger. I know." "Then why?" Cash thought about Sarah's locket, about Emma's carved wolf. He thought about 3 years of numbness, of wishing he was dead, but lacking the courage to make it happen. He thought about Grace's eyes, yellow and fierce, choosing to trust when trust was the hardest thing in the world. "Because for 3 years I've been alive but not living," he said finally. "I lost everything that mattered, and I couldn't figure out how to care about anything again. Then I saw her, saw Grace, and something in me recognized something in her. We were both wounded, both barely surviving, both protecting something precious." He met Holloway's eyes. "If I walk away now, I'm walking away from the only thing that's made me feel human since my family died. I can't do that." "I won't," Holloway nodded slowly. "Then I'll pray for you, my friend. And I'll do what I can to delay Cyrus, perhaps talk some sense into him. He won't listen, probably not. But I have to try. Same as you have to protect these wolves." Holloway stood, preparing to leave. "One more thing Tommy asked me to tell you. He's been watching. If Cyrus and his men ride out, Tommy will try to get word to you. Give you warning. That boy's going to get himself in trouble. He thinks you're worth the risk." Holloway smiled. "He's not the only one." After the Reverend left, Cash sat with Scout still sprawled on his foot, thinking about what had been said. He'd been so focused on his own loss, his own pain, that he'd forgotten people might still care whether he lived or died. That night, as the snow continued to fall, Cash took inventory of his defenses. 1 rifle, 40 rounds of ammunition. 1 pistol, 12 rounds, a knife. The layout of the land, which he knew better than Cyrus did, and Grace, who despite her injured legs still had teeth and the will to use them. It wasn't much of an army, but it would have to be enough. The pups had started howling, tiny, squeaky attempts that would someday become the full-throated songs of adult wolves. They practiced now, sitting in a wobbly line, pointing their small muzzles at the ceiling. Scout was the loudest, of course, throwing everything into the effort. Cash found himself smiling, despite the weight of what was coming. These small lives, this fierce mother, this unlikely family, was worth fighting for. Worth dying for, if it came to that. He checked the rifle one more time, then banked the fire for the night. Grace settled the pups for sleep, curling around them protectively. Cash lay on his bedroll, but sleep was a long time coming. Somewhere in the darkness, men were making plans. Somewhere out there, violence was gathering like a storm. But here, in this small cabin, there was warmth. There was trust. There was the sound of breathing, the rustle of fur, the tiny whimpers of dreaming pups. There was life, fragile and fierce. Cash touched the locket in his pocket, then the carved wolf on the shelf. Two different families, connected by grief and love across the boundary of death. "I'll protect them, Sarah," he whispered. "The way I couldn't protect you. I swear it." Outside, the snow fell and fell, covering the world in white silence, hiding tracks and intentions, making everything uncertain. Cash lay awake, listening to the wilderness, and prepared his heart for what was coming. Tommy arrived at dawn 3 days later, his horse lathered despite the cold, his young face tight with urgency. Cash heard him coming. He'd been sleeping light, waking at every sound, and met him outside, rifle in hand. The boy slid from his saddle, gasping for breath. "They're coming," Tommy panted. "Cyrus and 6 others. They left town an hour before sunrise. They've got dogs, torches, guns." He swallowed hard. "Mr. Delaney, they mean to kill you if you get in the way." Cash felt the words settle into him, cold and certain. "How long do I have?" 2 hours, maybe 3. They're coming the long way around, trying to approach from the North Ridge. Tommy grabbed Cash's arm. "You have to run. Take the wolf and go. I'll tell them you were already gone when I got here." Cash shook his head. "Grace can't run. Her leg won't take it, and the pups are too young to travel in this cold. We'd freeze before we got 10 miles, then just go yourself. Let them have the wolf. It's not worth dying for." "Yes," Cash said quietly. "It is." Tommy's face crumpled. "I don't understand. Why? She's just an animal." Cash looked past him, toward the North Ridge, where soon men would appear with murder in their hearts. "You ever lose someone you loved, Tommy? Someone you'd have died to protect?" "No, sir. I have, twice, my wife and daughter. I couldn't save them. Disease doesn't care how much you love someone, how desperate you are." Cash's voice roughened. "But Grace and those pups I can save. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe I am crazy, like everyone thinks. But if I run now, I'm the man who walked away. Again, and I can't be that man anymore." Tommy wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "Then I'll stay. Help you fight." "No," Cash's voice was firm. "You've done enough, more than enough. You ride back to town. Tell them you tried to warn me, but I wouldn't listen. Keep yourself clear of this, but that's an order, son. You've got your whole life ahead of you. Don't throw it away on a lost cause." Tommy mounted reluctantly, looking back over his shoulder. "May God watch over you, Mr. Delaney." "He hasn't so far," Cash said with a sad smile. "But I appreciate the thought." He watched the boy ride away, then turned back to the cabin. 2 hours, maybe 3. Time to make ready. Inside, Grace sensed his tension. She stood, favoring her bad leg, positioning herself between Cash and the pups. Protective instinct even toward him. "It's all right," Cash told her. "But we're going to have company. Bad company. I need you to keep the pups quiet if you can. Keep them in the corner, away from the door." He moved the table to create a barricade, stacked his spare ammunition where he could reach it, positioned himself with a clear line of sight to both door and window. The cabin's limitations were obvious. 1 room, limited cover, nowhere to retreat. But it had one advantage: narrow approaches that would funnel attackers, making numbers less decisive. As he worked, Scout kept trying to climb on him, treating it all as a game. Cash had to keep moving the pup back to the corner, where Grace would collect it with the others. "You're going to be trouble when you grow up," Cash told Scout. The pup wagged its small tail, oblivious to danger. An hour passed. Then another. Cash watched the ridgeline, his breathing steady, his mind clear. He'd been a cavalry scout once, before homesteading. He knew how to wait, how to read terrain, how to make every shot count. He also knew 7 against 1 were bad odds, even with defensive position. This would likely end with him dead and the wolves slaughtered. But at least he'd die for something. That was more than he'd had 3 years ago. Movement on the ridge. Cash's hand tightened on his rifle. He counted shapes. 7 men, just as Tommy said. 3 dogs ranging ahead. They were trying to approach quietly. But snow crunched under boots, and the dogs made it impossible to stay silent. Cash had a choice to make. Wait for them to get close or fire early and establish his seriousness. He chose the latter. The rifle shot cracked across the morning, echoing off the mountains. Snow kicked up 10 feet in front of the lead man, a warning shot, deliberately high. The group stopped. Even at this distance, Cash could see Cyrus's bulk at the center. "That's far enough," Cash shouted. "Turn around and go home." Cyrus's voice carried back. "Give us the wolf, Delaney. Do that and we'll leave you be." "No," a pause. "Then I need to talk to you. Face to face." "No tricks," Cash considered. It was likely a trap, a way to get close. But something in Cyrus's voice, a strange note he couldn't identify, made him hesitate. "Alone," Cash shouted back. "No guns! I'll shoot any man who moves while you approach." After a moment, Cyrus handed off his rifle and started down the slope. Cash kept his own rifle trained on him, finger on the trigger. Behind him, Grace growled low, sensing danger. Cyrus stopped 20 feet from the cabin door. This close, Cash could see his face clearly, and was surprised to find not anger, but something more complicated. Grief, maybe, or old pain. "I'm going to tell you something," Cyrus said. "Something that might change your mind about protecting that wolf. Nothing you say will change my mind. 5 years ago," Cyrus continued as if Cash hadn't spoken, "I had a daughter, Mary. She was 8 years old." His voice caught. "Sweetest child you ever saw. My wife died bringing her into the world, so it was just the 2 of us. She was everything." Cash's chest tightened. He knew where this was going. "We were at our claim, up near the Sweetwater. I was working the forge, and Mary was playing outside. I heard her scream." Cyrus's fists clenched. "By the time I got there, the wolves were on her. A whole pack. They'd come down from the high country, desperate from a hard winter. She didn't have a chance." Cash felt the words like blows. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "That's God, Cyrus, I'm sorry. I killed 3 of them that day. Tracked the rest for weeks, but they vanished into the mountains." Cyrus looked at the cabin, at the smoke rising from the chimney. "But I never forgot. Grey and black wolves, a big female leading them. And I swore if I ever found that pack, I'd wipe every last one of them from the earth. Grace wasn't. That wolf in there has the same markings as the leader. Same size, same coloring." Cyrus's voice went hard. "It's her, Delaney. It's the same animal that killed my little girl." Cash's world tilted. He looked back at the cabin, at Grace visible through the window. Could it be true? Was the creature he'd been protecting, the one he'd come to love in a strange way, responsible for a child's death? "You don't know that for certain," Cash said, but doubt crept into his voice. "I'm certain enough. And even if I'm wrong about this specific wolf, she's still a killer. That's what wolves do, they kill. Today it's rabbits and deer. Tomorrow, when those pups grow hungry enough, it'll be someone's cattle, someone's dogs, someone's child." Cyrus took a step closer. "You lost a daughter, too. You know what that feels like. Would you really protect the kind of animal that causes that pain?" Cash's hands shook. Emma's face swam in his memory, her laugh, her gentleness, her love for animals. What would she think if she knew? But then he remembered Grace, starving and tortured, still fighting to protect her unborn pups. He remembered nursing her back to health, watching her give birth, seeing the fierce tenderness with which she cared for her young. He remembered Scout climbing on his feet, the smallest pup seeking comfort against his leg, Grace allowing him to touch her pups, to be part of their family. Could that be the same creature Cyrus described? A mindless killer attacking a child? Or had Grace been desperate, starving, driven to it by the same harsh winter that had killed Sarah and Emma? Did that make her evil, or just an animal trying to survive in a brutal world? Cash thought of his own desperation after losing his family, the dark places his mind had gone, the things he'd considered. Was he so different from a wild creature doing whatever it took to live? "I don't know if it's the same wolf," Cash said finally. "I don't know what happened 5 years ago, but I know what's happening now. Right now, in that cabin, there's a mother with 4 pups who've never hurt anyone. And I won't let you kill them for something that may or may not have happened in the past." Cyrus's face darkened. "Then you're choosing her over me, over my daughter's memory, over every child in this territory. I'm choosing to judge Grace for what she is now, not what she might have been. Same way I'd want to be judged for trying to do better, not for all the ways I've failed. You're a fool. Delaney, maybe. But I'm a fool who knows what it's like to lose everything and still find something worth protecting." Cash raised his rifle. "Go home, Cyrus. Bury your pain the right way, not by creating more death." Cyrus stared at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was cold and final. "Then you'll die with her, and the blood of whatever she kills in the future will be on your hands." He turned and walked back to his men. Cash watched them confer, saw the gestures toward the cabin, the checking of weapons. The attack was coming. Cash went back inside, closed the door, braced it. Grace watched him with those yellow eyes, questioning. "I don't know if what he said is true," Cash told her. "I don't know if you were part of that pack, if you—" He stopped, unable to finish. "But I know who you are now, and that's enough." He positioned himself at the window, rifle ready. The pups, sensing the tension, huddled against their mother. Scout tried to be brave, but even the bold ones stayed close. Outside, the men spread out, preparing to attack from multiple angles. 7 men, dogs, guns, and fire against 1 man, 1 injured wolf, and 4 helpless pups. The odds hadn't changed. But somehow, neither had Cash's resolve. "Whatever happens," he said to Grace, to the pups, to Sarah and Emma's memory, "I'm glad I found you. I'm glad I fought for something again." Grace moved closer to him, positioned herself between him and the pups, ready to defend. Partners in this, to the end. The first shot shattered the morning silence, and the battle for the cabin began. The bullet punched through the oiled paper window and buried itself in the back wall, inches from Cash's head. He dropped instinctively, chambering another round, and returned fire through the broken window. He aimed deliberately high. He didn't want to kill anyone if he could avoid it, but he needed them to know he'd shoot. Another shot, this one splintering the doorframe. The dogs were barking now, worked into a frenzy by their handlers. Cash counted 3 separate shooting positions. Cyrus had split his men to surround the cabin. Smart tactics. Cash would have done the same. He moved to the other side of the window, fired toward the position on his left. A curse told him he'd come close enough to worry them. Good. Make them cautious, make them slow. The pups were crying, frightened by the noise. Grace herded them into the far corner, her body covering them, but she kept her eyes on Cash, ready to move if needed. Her ears were flat against her head, her lips pulled back in a snarl. "Stay there," Cash told her. "Protect them." A volley of shots peppered the cabin wall. The logs held, but splinters flew. Cash counted 5 shots, which meant they were spacing their fire, conserving ammunition for a siege rather than wasting it on a frontal assault. Also smart. Cyrus had clearly done this before, or at least thought it through. Cash had 40 rounds for the rifle, 12 for the pistol. He'd need to make every shot deliberate, every action count. He couldn't win this with firepower. His only hope was to make it costly enough that they'd give up. Decide Grace wasn't worth it, but looking at Cyrus's face, remembering his daughter's death, Cash knew that wouldn't happen. This was personal. This was grief hardened into hate, and nothing short of blood would satisfy it. Another shot shattered what remained of the window. Cash ducked, glass fragments raining down. He was about to return fire when he heard something that made his blood run cold. Dogs getting closer. They were sending the dogs in. He moved to the door, braced his shoulder against it, and waited. Seconds later, something heavy slammed into the wood from outside. A dog trying to break through. Then another. The door shuddered but held. Grace was on her feet now, snarling, her maternal instinct at war with the urge to defend. The pups huddled together, their small cries piercing. "It's all right," Cash said, though it wasn't. "The door will hold more impacts." The dogs were frantic, maddened by the scent of wolf. Cash heard men shouting, urging them on. He made a decision he hated, aimed his pistol at the door, and fired low through the wood. A dog yelped, the sound cutting off abruptly. The other dogs scattered, their confidence broken. Cash felt sick but pushed it down. This was survival now. No room for gentle sentiment. Pull them back. Cyrus's voice, angry. "We'll try something else." A lull in the shooting. Cash used it to reload, check his ammunition, take a drink of water. His hands were steady despite his racing heart, muscle memory from cavalry days, when staying calm under fire meant the difference between living and dying. He glanced at Grace. She was licking the pups, trying to settle them, but her eyes kept darting to the door, to the window, assessing threats. Even injured, even terrified, she was magnificent, all fierce devotion and protective fury. "I won't let them have you," Cash promised. "Whatever it takes." The attack resumed from a different angle. They'd moved positions, trying to flank. Cash tracked the muzzle flashes, returned fire, forced them back. But he was one man covering multiple approaches, and eventually they'd figure out the timing, rush him when he was reloading. An hour passed in bursts of violence, separated by tense silence. Cash had used 15 rounds. He'd wounded at least one man, heard the scream, but hadn't killed anyone yet. The men were getting bolder, though, working closer, learning the cabin's weak points. Then smoke began seeping under the door. Cash's heart sank. They'd set fire to something, probably straw or dried brush piled against the wall. The wind would drive the smoke inside, make the cabin unlivable, force him out. He stuffed rags into the gaps under the door, but smoke was already filling the small space. The pups coughed and whimpered. Grace's eyes streamed, but she kept her body over them, trying to filter the air. Cash had maybe 10 minutes before they'd all suffocate. He looked around desperately, calculating options. He could surrender, beg for the pups' lives at least. But he knew Cyrus. The man wouldn't stop until Grace was dead, and probably the pups too. Predators, all of them. He could fight his way out, try to break the siege. But that meant leaving Grace and the pups, and he'd be cut down in seconds. Or he could do the one thing he'd been avoiding, the thing his cavalry training had taught him when defense became impossible: attack. Cash checked his pistol. 12 rounds, grabbed his rifle and made his decision. He turned to Grace. "When I open that door, you run. Take the pups and go out the back, through the gap in the wall behind the bed. Head for the creek, follow it downstream. There's caves there, places to hide." He knew she couldn't understand, but he said it anyway, needing to believe there was a chance. "Go, Grace! Save them!" He shoved the bed aside, revealing a gap in the logs where the chinking had fallen out, barely big enough for a wolf to squeeze through, but it might work. He widened it with a few kicks, his lungs burning from smoke. Then he positioned himself at the door, took 3 deep breaths, and burst through. The suddenness of it caught them off guard. Cash came out shooting, the rifle barking in his hands. He saw Cyrus diving for cover, saw one of the sons, Clayton, bringing his gun up. Cash fired, hit him in the shoulder, and the young man went down screaming. Men scattered, shouting. Cash ran toward the nearest position, firing as he went. The element of surprise gave him seconds, maybe half a minute. He used every second. He reached the boulder where 2 men had taken cover and vaulted over it, his pistol out now. The men stumbled back, one raising his hands. Cash didn't shoot, just motioned them away. They ran, wanting no part of close combat with a madman. Behind him he heard snarling. He risked a glance back and saw Grace emerging from the cabin, a pup in her jaws. She limped toward the back, toward safety, even as bullets kicked up snow around her. "Cover her!" Cash shouted to no one, to God, to anyone listening, and fired at the men targeting her. Cyrus appeared from behind the cabin, his rifle aimed at Grace. Cash saw it happening as if time had slowed, the blacksmith's finger tightening on the trigger, the rifle barrel tracking the injured wolf as she struggled through the snow. Cash didn't think. He charged. He hit Cyrus from the side, both of them going down in a tangle of limbs. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air. They grappled in the snow, Cyrus trying to bring the gun to bear, Cash trying to wrench it away. Cyrus was bigger, stronger. He drove his knee into Cash's injured back, the old wound screaming, and Cash's grip loosened. The blacksmith got a hand on Cash's throat, squeezed. Cash saw spots, felt his vision tunneling. He fumbled for his knife, found it, drove it upward, not to kill. Some part of him still refused that, but to wound, to stop this. The blade caught Cyrus in the side, not deep but painful. The blacksmith howled and released his grip. Cash rolled away, gasping for air, and found his pistol. He pointed it at Cyrus, his hand shaking. "Enough," he rasped. "It's over." Cyrus lay on his back, blood seeping from his side, his face twisted with rage and pain. "Kill me, then." "Do it." "No." Cash kept the gun trained, but didn't fire. "I'm not you. I don't kill out of revenge. My daughter, your daughter is dead, and nothing will bring her back. Not this, not killing Grace." Cash's voice broke. "I know that pain. God, I know it. But you're letting it turn you into something she wouldn't recognize." For a moment, something flickered in Cyrus's eyes. Doubt, maybe, or the beginning of recognition. But then it hardened again, and he reached for his rifle. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Cash's gun or Cyrus's rifle. It came from the ridge, from a different direction entirely. Everyone froze. Cash turned and saw riders, a dozen men, led by Reverend Holloway on his bay mare. And beside him, Sheriff Dixon from Cheyenne, his badge catching the morning light. "Nobody move," the sheriff called out. "This ends now." Cyrus's remaining men began backing away, lowering their weapons. The fight went out of them the moment the law arrived. The sheriff rode forward, taking in the scene. The burning cabin, the wounded men, Cash and Cyrus on the ground. His expression was hard. "I've been hearing reports about a siege up here," Dixon said. "Reverend Holloway came to me yesterday, concerned about violence. Looks like he was right to worry. Sheriff, this man is harboring a dangerous wolf." Cyrus protested, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. "A killer." "I'll determine what's dangerous and what's not," Dixon cut him off. "Right now, I see one man defending his property and 7 men attacking it. That's clear as day." He looked at Cash. "You all right, Delaney?" Cash nodded, not trusting his voice. He was searching the trees, looking for Grace, praying she'd gotten away. "The wolf killed my daughter." Cyrus's voice was raw with desperation. 5 years ago. I recognized her. Dixon's expression softened slightly. "I remember that day, Cyrus. I was there." "A terrible thing," he paused. "But you can't be certain this is the same animal. And even if it was, this isn't how we handle things. This is vigilante justice, and I won't have it in my territory, so he just gets to keep it." "Keep a predator?" "If the wolf's on his land not threatening anyone, then yes." Dixon turned to Cash. "That sound about right? She been threatening anyone?" "She can barely walk," Cash said. "Her legs crippled from a trap. All she does is nurse her pups." "Pups," Cyrus laughed bitterly. "Perfect. More wolves." Dixon ignored him. "I'm going to need you all to come into Cheyenne. Give statements. We'll sort this out proper." He gestured to his men, who began collecting weapons from Cyrus's group as the others were being rounded up. Holloway dismounted and came to Cash. "Tommy rode through the night to find me, told me what was happening. I went straight to the sheriff." He gripped Cash's shoulder. "You're safe now." Cash looked at the smoldering cabin, at the blood in the snow, at the chaos of the morning. "I have to find her, Grace. She took the pups and ran." "Then go," Holloway said. "We'll handle this." Cash didn't wait. He stood, ignoring his bruises and the pain in his back, and headed for the gap in the cabin wall, following the tracks in the snow. They led toward the creek, just as he'd told Grace to go. The trail showed her struggle. 3 trips back and forth, each time carrying a pup in her jaws. The tracks were uneven, her injured leg dragging, but she'd kept going. Cash followed them downstream, his heart in his throat. 1/2 mile on, he found the cave he'd been thinking of. a shallow hollow under an overhanging rock, hidden by brush, there in the darkness. Yellow eyes watched him. Grace lay with all 4 pups tucked against her belly, all of them alive, all of them safe. She'd saved them all, despite her wounds, despite the bullets and dogs and fire. Cash dropped to his knees in the snow. Overwhelmed. "You did it," he whispered. "You magnificent creature. You saved them." Scout, brave little Scout, waddled toward him on unsteady pup legs. Cash picked him up, felt the small heartbeat against his palm, and something in his chest that had been clenched for 3 years finally let go. He wept, for Sarah, for Emma, for all the pain and loss and loneliness. But also for this, for Grace's fierce love, for 4 tiny lives preserved, for his own heart learning to beat again. Grace watched him cry, tilted her head, then did something that stopped his breath. She moved forward, slowly, and pressed her nose against his cheek. A gesture of comfort, of understanding, of family. Cash wrapped one arm around her neck, careful of her wounds, and held his unlikely family close as the winter sun broke through the clouds, warming them all. The legal proceedings in Cheyenne took 3 days. Cash sat through testimony after testimony, watching Cyrus and his men try to justify the siege. The sheriff remained unmoved. "You attacked a man's home," Dixon said flatly, when Cyrus finished his impassioned speech about protecting the territory from predators. "Burned his property, wounded him. That's assault, arson, and attempted murder. I don't care what your reasons were, but the wolf is an animal living on private land, harming no one." Dixon leaned forward. "Tell me, Cyrus, you seen this wolf attack anything? Kill any livestock? Threaten any person?" Cyrus's jaw worked. "Not yet. But it's only a matter of time. That's not how law works. We deal with crimes committed, not crimes imagined." Dixon turned to Cash. "Mr. Delaney, do you intend to keep the wolf on your property? Keep her contained?" "She can't survive in the wild," Cash said. "Her leg's too damaged. She'd starve." He paused. "But yes, I'll keep her on my land. She won't be a threat to anyone. And the pups?" Cash hadn't thought that far ahead. "They're still nursing. Can't be separated from their mother. When they're old enough, He stopped, unsure what the right answer was. "I don't know. I'll figure something out." Dixon studied him for a long moment. "I'm going to make this official. Cash Delaney has permission to keep 1 adult wolf and 4 pups on his property, provided they remain contained and cause no harm to persons or livestock. Any violation and they'll be destroyed. Clear?" "Clear," Cash said, relief flooding through him. Cyrus stood abruptly. "This is wrong. You're protecting a killer. I'm enforcing the law," Dixon replied. "Something you failed to do. Now sit down, or I'll add contempt to your charges." The blacksmith sat, but the look he gave Cash promised this wasn't over, not in his mind. Anyway, the charges against Cyrus and his men were reduced to destruction of property and reckless endangerment. They paid fines, covered the cost of rebuilding Cash's cabin, and were given stern warnings about future vigilante action. Clayton, nursing his wounded shoulder, looked chastened. Cyrus looked furious. As they filed out of the courthouse, Reverend Holloway approached Cash on the steps. "How's Grace?" he asked. "Healing. Skittish but safe." Cash managed a small smile. "The pups are getting bigger every day, eating solid food now. And you?" Cash considered the question honestly. "I'm better. Still grieving Sarah and Emma. Don't know if that ever stops. But I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living again. That's something." Holloway nodded. "God works in mysterious ways. I never would have guessed a wolf would be the instrument of your healing, but here we are." "Maybe that's the point," Cash said. "We look for healing in expected places and miss it when it arrives from the wilderness." A few townspeople had gathered to watch the proceedings end. Most looked at Cash with curiosity or mild disapproval, but a few, including Morton from the general store and young Tommy, offered nods of support. Tommy ran up as Cash was preparing to leave. "Mr. Delaney, is it true? You get to keep Grace." "For now," Cash said, "long as she causes no trouble. Could I visit sometime? See the pups?" The boy's eyes were bright with hope. Cash hesitated, then nodded. Once they're a bit older." And only if you promise to be calm and quiet. They're wild animals, Tommy, not pets. I promise." Tommy practically bounced with excitement. "Thank you, sir." The ride back to his land took most of a day. The cabin was a ruin. The fire had gutted it, leaving only the stone chimney and some of the log walls standing. Cash would have to rebuild, but at least he had compensation from Cyrus's fines. He'd left Grace and the pups in the cave with enough food to last several days. As he approached now, calling softly, Grace emerged from the shadows. She'd been listening for him, waiting. The pups tumbled out behind her, Scout in the lead as always, the others following. They'd grown noticeably even in 3 days. Their puppy awkwardness was giving way to developing coordination and strength. Scout launched himself at Cash's legs, trying to climb. Cash scooped him up, laughing despite himself. "You're getting heavy, little man." He'd brought fresh venison, which Grace devoured while the pups investigated Cash's saddlebags. He sat with them as the sun set, this unlikely family, and made plans. First, rebuild the cabin, bigger this time, with a separate space for the wolves. Second, fence a portion of his land to give them room to roam safely. Third, figure out what happened when the pups grew to adulthood. Could they stay? Would they need to go? Problems for another day. Tonight, they were all alive and together, and that was enough. Grace settled beside him, the pups nursing one more time before sleep. She looked at Cash with those intelligent yellow eyes, and he wondered again about Cyrus's accusation. Had she been part of the pack that killed his daughter? He'd never know for certain. But he'd made his choice. To judge Grace for who she was now, a devoted mother protecting her young, not for what she might have been in desperate circumstances. Wasn't that what everyone deserved? The chance to be seen for their present self, not forever defined by their worst moments. Cash thought of his own worst moments, the weeks after Sarah and Emma died, when he'd wished for death, when he'd been cruel to people trying to help, when he'd given up on everything good. If someone had judged him only on that, they'd have written him off as hopeless. But Grace hadn't judged him. She'd simply trusted gradually, letting him prove himself through action rather than words. "Thank you," he told her quietly, "for giving me a reason to keep going." Grace's ear twitched toward him, listening. Scout, drowsy from nursing, crawled into Cash's lap and fell asleep there, warm and trusting. Cash stroked the pup's soft fur and watched the stars emerge overhead. Tomorrow he'd start rebuilding, start planning for a future that included wolves, and maybe eventually included rejoining the world of people. But tonight, he'd simply sit with his family and be grateful for the second chance he'd been given. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying no threats, only the promise of spring eventually coming, of ice melting, of things frozen beginning to thaw. 2 months later, on a day when the snow was finally beginning to retreat and early crocuses pushed through the frozen ground, Cyrus Gant came to Cash's rebuilt cabin. Cash saw him approaching from a distance and reached for his rifle, then stopped himself. The blacksmith was alone, riding slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. This wasn't an attack. Cash stepped outside, waiting. Cyrus dismounted 20 feet away. He looked older than he had at the trial. The fight seemed to have gone out of him, leaving only weariness. His wound from Cash's knife had healed, but he moved carefully, favoring that side. "Come to finish this?" Cash asked, not hostile, but direct. "No." Cyrus shook his head. I don't rightly know. "Talk, maybe. Try to understand." Cash considered sending him away, then gestured to the rough bench he'd built beside the door. "All right, talk." They sat in awkward silence for a moment. From inside the cabin came the sounds of the pups, no longer tiny infants, but rambunctious juveniles, wrestling and play-fighting. Grace's low warning growl told them to settle down. Cyrus flinched at the sound. "That's them? 4 healthy pups, growing fast. And the mother?" "Grace, you call her?" "Her leg's healed as much as it will. She'll always limp, but she gets around." Cash studied the older man. "Why are you here, Cyrus?" Cyrus was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I've been thinking about what you said at the trial, about my daughter not recognizing what I've become." Cash waited, Mary loved animals, all kinds. Used to bring home injured birds, rabbits, once a fox kit that had lost its mother. Cyrus's voice caught. I'd tell her they were dangerous, they'd bite her, but she'd just smile and say everything deserves kindness. She was better than me, better than most people. She sounds like she was special. She was. Cyrus wiped at his eyes roughly. After she died, I thought the only way to honor her was to make sure what happened to her never happened again. Kill every wolf, every predator. Keep everyone safe. But that's not what she would have wanted. No. Cyrus shook his head. She'd have wanted, God, I don't know. Compassion probably, understanding, the things I've had none of for 5 years. Cash felt something shift in his chest. This man had tried to kill him, had nearly succeeded in killing Grace and the pups. But sitting here, seeing his grief laid bare, Cash recognized himself in Cyrus, the same pain, the same desperate attempt to make sense of loss. I lost my wife and daughter to fever, Cash said quietly. Sarah and Emma 3 years ago. I spent those 3 years wishing I'd died with them, too angry to live but too cowardly to die, until the wolf, until Grace. She gave me something to protect, someone who needed me, made me remember who I'd been before. He stopped, swallowed. Before I let grief turn me into someone I hated. Cyrus looked at him directly for the first time. Do you ever wonder if she was the one? The wolf from my claim. Every day, Cash admitted. I'll never know for sure. And I've made my peace with that uncertainty. Even if she was, wolves were starving that winter. Acting on instinct, not malice. It doesn't make what happened to Mary acceptable, but it doesn't make Grace evil either. I wanted someone to blame, Cyrus said. Something to focus all this. He gestured vaguely at his chest. All this rage and hurt made it easier than just sitting with the grief. I understand that. I do, Cash paused. But at some point you have to choose. Keep feeding the hate or try to find a different way forward. They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, warming the air. Inside, one of the pups, sounded like Scout, let out a long, experimental howl. It was still more squeak than song, but it made both men smile despite themselves. Cyrus started again. Could I see them? Not to hurt them. Just to, I don't know. Try to understand what you saw in her, Cash considered, weighing risk against the possibility of healing. Finally he stood. Stay here. Let me talk to her first. Inside, Grace was immediately alert, sensing Cash's tension. The pups gathered around her, picking up on her wariness. Cash knelt beside them. There's a man outside. He wanted to hurt you once, but I hope he's changed. Cash stroked Grace's head gently. I'm going to bring him to the door. Just to look. You don't have to do anything. Just let him see you. Can you trust me on this? Grace studied him with those ancient knowing eyes. Then she settled back, keeping the pups close but not hiding them. Cash returned outside. Come to the door. Move slowly. Don't make any sudden moves or loud sounds. Cyrus approached, as if walking on eggshells. Cash opened the door part way, giving him a clear view inside. The blacksmith stopped, staring. Grace met his gaze steadily, 4 growing pups tucked against her, grey and black fur, yellow eyes, wild and beautiful, and very much alive. Cyrus's face crumpled. She's just a mother. Protecting her babies. Yes, I wanted her to be a monster. Needed her to be. But she's just... His voice broke. She's just an animal trying to survive. Like all of us. Scout, brave and curious as always, took a few steps toward the door. Grace made a soft sound, and the pup stopped, but those young eyes fixed on Cyrus with innocent interest. That one's the bold one, Cash said. First to explore, first to try new things. Reminds me of... He stopped. Of Mary, Cyrus finished quietly. She was like that too, fearless. They stood together, watching the wolves, 2 fathers who'd lost everything, learning to hold something new. The moment stretched, fragile and precious. Finally, Cyrus stepped back. Thank you for letting me see them. Where will you go from here? Cash asked. Home, back to my work. Try to remember Mary the way she actually was, not the way my grief has been painting her. Cyrus extended his hand, hesitant. I can't promise we'll be friends. This cuts too deep. But I can promise I won't come after your wolves again. Cash shook his hand. That's enough. As Cyrus mounted his horse, he looked back one more time. Take care of them. All of them. I will. Cash watched him ride away, feeling something like closure settling over the moment. The past couldn't be changed. Mary would still be dead. Sarah and Emma would still be gone. But the future could be different. Could be better. He went back inside where Grace and the pups waited. Scout immediately climbed on his feet, demanding attention. Cash picked him up, felt the solid weight of growing life. You're going to be big, he told the pup. Strong and wild and free. And I'm going to make sure you have that chance. Grace moved to his side, pressed against his leg. A gesture she'd been making more often lately. Pack behavior. Claiming him as family. Cash looked around his rebuilt cabin. At the family he'd found in the wilderness. At the life he was slowly, painfully building from the ashes of loss. It wasn't what he'd had before. It would never be that. But it was something. Something worth waking up for, worth fighting for, worth living for, and for a man who'd spent 3 years wishing he was dead. That was everything. Spring arrived in full force, transforming the Wyoming Territory from frozen wasteland to blooming meadow. Cash stood at the fence line he'd built, watching the pups, nearly adolescent wolves now, explore their enclosed territory. Scout led the way as always, with his siblings following in a tumbling mass of grey and black fur. Grace lay in the shade of a pine tree, watching her offspring with patient attention. Her injured leg was stretched out, the limp permanent but no longer painful. She'd adapted, learned to move efficiently despite the handicap. In the wild, she'd have died. Here, with Cash, she thrived. 4 months had passed since the siege. 4 months of rebuilding, not just the cabin, but everything. Cash had steady work now, hired by nearby ranchers who'd heard about the man who'd defended a wolf against 7 armed men. They figured anyone that's stubborn and capable was worth employing. The money wasn't much, but it was enough. More than that, he had purpose. Grace and the pups needed him, and he needed them. It was a simple equation that had saved his life. Young Tommy visited weekly now, bringing supplies from town and news. He'd sit for hours watching the pups, sketching them in a journal he'd started keeping. I'm going to be a naturalist, he'd told Cash proudly. Study animals. Write about them. Make people understand they're not just things to kill. Your folks approve. Cash had asked. They think I'm crazy. But Reverend Holloway says following your calling is more important than following expectations. Tommy grinned. Besides, somebody's got to document the miracle of Cash Delaney and his wolves. The story had spread throughout the territory, embellished and exaggerated naturally, but the core remained true. The broken cowboy who'd found redemption protecting a pregnant wolf. People came sometimes curious, wanting to see the famous Grace and her pups. Cash turned most away, but a few, those who showed genuine respect, he allowed a glimpse. One visitor surprised him. Morton from the general store arrived one afternoon with a proposal. I'm thinking of writing an article for the territorial newspaper, he said, unusually nervous, about coexistence. Man and predator finding a way to live together. Would you let me interview you? Cash had been skeptical. Why? Because people need to hear it. Morton looked at Grace, resting peacefully in her enclosure. All my life I've thought of wolves as enemies. Things to kill on sight. But watching you with her, seeing those pups grow up gentle because they've never known cruelty, it changes something. Makes me think we've been doing it wrong all this time. The article ran 2 weeks later. It brought more visitors, more curiosity. Some supportive, some critical, but Cash had learned to live with both. He'd made his choice, and he'd stand by it. Reverend Holloway came monthly, ostensibly to check on Cash's spiritual well-being, but really just to sit and talk. They'd become friends, these 2 men bound by their understanding that healing took strange forms. I've been thinking about forgiveness, Holloway said during one visit, watching Scout try to dig under the fence. How it's not really about excusing what happened, but about choosing not to let it poison your future. You talking about Cyrus? Cash asked. About all of us. Holloway smiled. You've forgiven Grace for whatever she might have been. Forgiven yourself for the years you spent wishing you were dead. Those are harder tasks than forgiving an enemy. Cash considered this, stroking Grace's head as she leaned against him. "I'm still learning. Some days are harder than others. That's the nature of grief. It doesn't disappear, just transforms. Becomes something you can carry without being crushed by it." That evening, after Holloway left, Cash took Sarah's locket and the carved wooden wolf from the shelf where he kept them. He sat outside as the sun set, holding both artifacts, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. Sarah and Emma would always be part of him. The grief of losing them would never fully fade. But it no longer defined every moment, no longer made him wish for death. He thought of what Emma might say if she could see him now. She probably loved the pups, especially Scout. She'd want to hear stories about Grace's courage, about the night she gave birth, about how they'd become a family. "I'm trying to honor what you taught me," Cash said to her memory. "About compassion, about standing up for those who can't defend themselves. I hope you'd be proud." The pups came to investigate, drawn by his voice. They were losing their puppy softness, becoming sleek and powerful. Soon they'd be fully grown, and Cash would face a decision he'd been avoiding. What happened then? He couldn't keep 4 adult wolves forever. The enclosure was large, but not infinite. They'd need room to run, to hunt, to be wild. Yet releasing them felt like another loss he wasn't ready to face. One day at a time, he told himself. The same advice Sarah had given him when Emma was born, and he'd been terrified of fatherhood. "You don't have to solve tomorrow's problems today." Grace settled beside him, and the pups sprawled around them both, a pack, bonded not by blood alone, but by choice and survival and love that transcended species. Cash looked at the Wyoming sky, painted gold and purple by the setting sun, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Contentment, not happiness. Exactly. Happiness seemed too simple a word for something built on such complicated foundations. But contentment, yes. Peace with where he was, who he'd become. He'd been a husband, a father, a homesteader. He'd lost everything and become a ghost, barely alive. Then a pregnant wolf had looked at him with defiant yellow eyes, and he'd remembered how to fight, how to care, how to live. The story people told in town wasn't quite accurate. They said Cash Delaney had saved a wolf. The truth was more complicated, more beautiful. Grace had saved him first. As darkness fell and the first stars emerged, Cash sat with his unlikely family and thought about the future. There would be challenges ahead. There always were. The pups would grow, decisions would need to be made, and somewhere out there people still believed wolves were nothing but predators. But tonight, in this moment, there was peace. There was warmth. There was the sound of breathing, the rustle of fur, the quiet presence of beings who trusted him completely. Cash Delaney, who'd once been broken beyond repair, was whole again. Different than before, shaped by loss and love in equal measure. But whole, and that was everything. He closed his hand around Sarah's locket, feeling its familiar weight, then looked at Grace and her pups surrounding him in the gathering dusk. 2 families, separated by death and joined by grace. Sometimes the coldest winters reveal the warmest hearts. Cash smiled, finally understanding what that meant, and welcomed the night.